I thought I knew cruelty until I discovered what happened to thieves in ancient Babylon. Picture this. You're caught stealing a loaf of bread, and instead of losing a hand, they force you to marry the baker's daughter and work his fields for 7 years. Sound merciful? Wait until you hear what they did to the baker if the bread was moldy. As I delved deeper into the archives of human justice, I realized that our ancestors didn't just punish crime. They crafted elaborate psychological tortures that would make modern interrogators weep. The Romans threw people to lions, sure, but that was child's play compared to what the Persians did to oath-breakers, or how the Egyptians dealt with tomb robbers. What I'm about to share with you will change how you think about justice, mercy, and the very nature of human creativity when it comes to making people suffer. Because sometimes, the strangest punishments weren't designed to kill. They were designed to make you wish you were dead. When I first started researching ancient legal systems, I expected to find simple brutality, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. But what I discovered was far more complex and infinitely more disturbing. These weren't savage societies mindlessly inflicting pain. They were sophisticated civilizations that had turned punishment into an art form, each method carefully crafted to fit not just the crime, but the psychology of the criminal. From the sun-baked ziggurats of Mesopotamia to the marble halls of Rome, from the shadow of the pyramids to the gardens of Babylon, every great empire developed its own unique approach to making wrongdoers pay. Some focused on public humiliation, others on physical transformation, and still others on creating punishments so bizarre that the mere threat of them kept entire populations in line. The Code of Hammurabi, one of the world's first legal documents, didn't just list crimes and punishments. It revealed a society obsessed with making the punishment fit not just the crime, but the criminal's place in the social order. A noble who stole faced a different fate than a slave who committed the same offense, and both faced something far stranger than simple execution. But to understand how twisted these punishments could become, we need to start with the empire that made cruelty into statecraft. The Persian Empire stretched from India to Greece, and with it came a legal system that would make Kafka proud. I spent months studying their approach to justice, and what I found was a bureaucracy of suffering that operated with clockwork precision. When Darius the Great conquered new territories, he didn't just impose Persian law, he studied local customs and found ways to make punishment more psychologically devastating than anything the conquered peoples had ever imagined. Take the case of Oroetes, a Persian satrap who betrayed his emperor. Darius could have simply executed him, but instead, he devised something far more elaborate. Oroetes was forced to watch as his wealth was redistributed to his enemies. His family was married off to his rivals, and his name was literally chiseled away from every monument and inscription in his province. But here's where it gets truly disturbing. They kept him alive to witness all of this, feeding him just enough to maintain his health while systematically erasing every trace of his existence. The Persians had discovered something that would influence legal systems for millennia, the power of making someone disappear while they were still breathing. But this was just the beginning of their innovations in the art of punishment. The Persian practice of scaphism represents perhaps the most elaborate execution method ever devised, and I warn you, what I'm about to describe will stay with you long after this video ends. The condemned person was stripped naked and placed between two boats or hollowed-out tree trunks, with only their head, hands, and feet exposed. They were then force-fed milk and honey until they developed severe diarrhea, which would attract insects to their body. The boats were set adrift on a stagnant pond, and the victim was left to die slowly as insects and vermin fed on their flesh and waste. But here's what makes this punishment truly Persian in its sophistication. It wasn't random cruelty. It was reserved specifically for those who had committed crimes against the natural order, parricides, those who had killed their parents, and others who had violated the sacred bonds of family. The Persians believed that someone who would destroy the source of their own life deserved to experience the corruption of life itself. The punishment could last for days or even weeks, with the victim remaining conscious throughout most of the ordeal, trapped in their own decomposing body. What's most chilling is that Persian records show this punishment was rarely carried out. The mere threat of it was enough to maintain order. They had weaponized the human imagination against itself. The Persian legal system also gave us the concept of fitting punishment, but with a twist that reveals the true sophistication of their cruelty. When a Persian nobleman was caught embezzling funds meant for maintaining roads, he wasn't just fined or imprisoned. He was forced to personally repair every mile of road that had fallen into disrepair because of his theft, using his own resources and labor. This might sound reasonable until you realize that Persian roads stretched for thousands of miles, and the work was designed to be literally impossible to complete. The nobleman would spend years working on roads, becoming increasingly impoverished and physically broken, all while traveling through the very territories where his crime had caused suffering. Local populations were encouraged to mock and humiliate him, and his family was forbidden from helping him in any way. The punishment was designed to be perpetual, ensuring that the criminal would never truly be free even if they somehow completed the impossible task. It was psychological warfare disguised as justice, and it was so effective that Persian road maintenance became legendary across the ancient world. But the Persians weren't content to merely perfect punishment. They were also pioneers in using it as a tool of statecraft and control. The most disturbing aspect of Persian justice wasn't the cruelty, it was the precision. Every punishment was calibrated to achieve specific psychological and social outcomes. And the Persian legal scholars who designed these torments were some of the most educated men of their time. They understood human nature in ways that would make modern psychologists uncomfortable, and they used that understanding to create punishments that were more effective than simple brutality. When a Persian judge sentenced someone to a punishment, he wasn't just addressing the crime. He was sending a message to the entire empire about the nature of order, authority, and the consequences of challenging either. The Persian Empire lasted for over 2 centuries, and their legal innovations influenced every subsequent civilization that encountered them. But their sophisticated approach to punishment would soon meet its match in a civilization that would take their innovations and transform them into something even more systematic and terrifying. The Roman perfection of spectacle Rome didn't invent cruelty, they industrialized it. As I researched Roman punishment methods, I discovered that they had taken the Persian innovations and scaled them up to match their imperial ambitions. Where the Persians had created elaborate individual punishments, the Romans created a system of public spectacle that turned suffering into entertainment and social control into mass psychology. The gladiatorial games are well known, but they were just the tip of the iceberg. The Romans developed punishments that were specifically designed to be witnessed by thousands, and they used architecture, timing, and theatrical elements to maximize the psychological impact on both the condemned and the audience. When a Roman was sentenced to death, they weren't just being punished. They were becoming part of a carefully orchestrated performance that reinforced the power of the state and the consequences of defying it. But the Romans had also inherited something from the Persians that would prove far more significant: the understanding that the most effective punishments were those that broke the spirit before they broke the body. The Roman practice of damnatio ad bestias, condemnation to the beasts, represents the perfect fusion of punishment and propaganda. I've studied the architectural plans of the Colosseum, and what I found was a machine designed to produce specific psychological outcomes. The condemned weren't just thrown to lions randomly. They were dressed as characters from mythology, forced to reenact famous scenes of divine punishment, and their deaths were choreographed to tell stories that reinforced Roman values and warned against Roman crimes. A Christian might be dressed as Orpheus and torn apart by bears, symbolically representing the fate of those who challenged Roman gods. A military deserter might be forced to play Hercules, only to discover that his supposedly fake lion was very real. The Romans understood that execution was just the final moment of a longer performance that began with the arrest, continued through the trial, and culminated in the arena. They had turned death into theater, and the audience was complicit in every moment of it. But this level of sophistication in public punishment was only possible because of innovations they had developed in private torture. Roman private punishment was where they truly perfected the art of making people suffer. The career of Sejanus, who betrayed Emperor Tiberius, provides a perfect example of how Romans could make death into a prolonged psychological ordeal. Instead of simply executing Sejanus, Tiberius orchestrated a months-long campaign of systematic destruction that began with rumors and ended with a death so brutal that Roman historians struggled to describe it. First, Sejanus was isolated from his allies through a carefully orchestrated series of coincidences that made each of them believe the others had betrayed him. Then, his children were arrested and tortured in front of him, not for information, but to break his spirit. His wife was forced to divorce him and marry his greatest enemy, and his property was distributed to people he had wronged. Only after Sejanus had been completely destroyed psychologically was he finally executed. But even then, the Romans had one final innovation. They denied him the dignity of a quick death. Instead, he was strangled slowly while the crowd counted each second. Aloud, turning his final moments into a public humiliation that would be remembered for generations. The Romans had discovered that the anticipation of death could be more torturous than death itself. But perhaps the most Roman innovation in punishment was their use of legal fiction to create torments that were both creative and technically lawful. The punishment of poena cullii, the penalty of the sack, was reserved for parricides and represents the peak of Roman legal creativity. The condemned person was sewn into a leather sack along with a dog, a rooster, a viper, and a monkey, then thrown into a river or the sea. Each animal was chosen for its symbolic significance. The dog represented shamelessness, the rooster represented aggression against one's own kind, the viper represented treachery, and the monkey represented the degradation of human nature. But here's what makes this punishment uniquely Roman. It was designed to be both a death sentence and a religious ritual that would purify the community of the contamination caused by the crime. The Romans believed that parricide was such an offense against the natural order that it threatened the stability of the entire state, and the punishment was designed to symbolically restore that order through the death of the criminal. The legal scholars who designed this punishment spent years debating the proper type of sack, the appropriate animals, and even the correct method of sewing, because they understood that every detail had to be perfect for the punishment to achieve its intended effect. They had turned execution into sacrament, and in doing so, they had created a model that would influence legal systems for over 1,000 years. The Egyptian mysteries of eternal punishment. Egypt presented me with the most psychologically complex punishment system I've ever encountered, because the Egyptians believed that death was just the beginning of existence, not the end. This belief fundamentally changed how they approached justice, leading to punishments that were designed to extend beyond the grave and into eternity. When I first encountered the concept of punishment of the Ka, the spiritual double, I thought it was simply religious superstition. But as I delved deeper into Egyptian legal texts, I realized that they had developed a system of punishment that was far more sophisticated than anything the Persians or Romans had imagined. The Egyptians understood that true justice required more than just physical suffering or social humiliation. It required the complete destruction of a person's spiritual essence, their ability to exist in the afterlife, and their connection to the divine order that governed the universe. They had created punishments that were designed to damn souls for eternity, and they had the theological and legal framework to make those punishments stick. The Egyptian practice of name destruction represents perhaps the most thorough form of punishment ever devised by any civilization. When someone committed a crime serious enough to warrant this punishment, their name was literally erased from existence. Every inscription, every papyrus, every monument that bore their name was systematically destroyed or altered. Their family was forbidden from speaking their name. Their children were given new names, and their property was redistributed to people who had never known them. But this was just the beginning of the process. The Egyptians believed that a person's name was literally part of their soul, and that destroying the name would prevent the soul from existing in the afterlife. The condemned person was forced to watch as their identity was systematically erased, knowing that they were not just being killed, they were being removed from the cosmic order itself. The process could take months or even years, and it was designed to be so complete that it would be as if the person had never existed at all. Egyptian records show that this punishment was so effective that there are crimes mentioned in legal texts where the criminal's name has been completely erased, leaving only the description of their offense as evidence that they ever lived. The Egyptians also developed the concept of living mummification, a punishment so bizarre that it sounds like fiction until you encounter it in actual legal documents. Criminals who committed crimes against the dead, tomb robbers, mostly, were subjected to the complete mummification process while still alive. This involved the removal of internal organs, the application of preserving salts and resins, and the wrapping in linen bandages, all while the criminal remained conscious. The process was designed to be slow enough that the criminal would survive most of it, experiencing the transformation from living person to preserved corpse. But here's where the punishment becomes truly Egyptian in its sophistication. The criminal was told that this process would prevent them from dying properly, trapping them in a state between life and death for eternity. They would be preserved forever, but they would never be able to join the afterlife because they had been transformed into a mockery of proper mummification. The psychological impact of this punishment was so severe that tomb robbing became extremely rare in Egypt, despite the enormous wealth that could be gained from it. The Egyptians had discovered that the fear of eternal punishment was more effective than any physical torture. But the most disturbing aspect of Egyptian punishment was their development of cursed execution, a method that combined physical death with spiritual damnation in ways that influenced magical thinking for millennia. When someone was sentenced to cursed execution, they were not just killed, they were killed in a way that would prevent their soul from ever finding peace. This involved specific rituals, particular weapons, and careful timing that were all designed to trap the soul in a state of perpetual suffering. The condemned person was forced to participate in their own cursing, reciting prayers that would damn their own soul and prevent them from ever achieving the afterlife. The execution itself was performed by priests who had been specially trained in the rituals required to ensure spiritual damnation, and the entire process was designed to be so thorough that it would affect not just the criminal, but their entire family line. Egyptian magical texts describe these rituals in detail, and they reveal a level of sophistication in psychological torture that is genuinely disturbing. The Egyptians had weaponized the afterlife itself, turning the universal human fear of death into a tool of social control that was more effective than any physical punishment. They had created a system where the punishment continued after death, and the knowledge of this fact was enough to maintain order among the living. The Babylonian codes of proportional suffering. Babylon gave the world its first written legal code. But what I discovered in the Code of Hammurabi was far more than just an eye for an eye. The Babylonians had developed a system of punishment that was mathematically precise, socially stratified, and psychologically devastating in ways that would influence legal thinking for thousands of years. When I first read the code, I thought I was looking at primitive justice, simple retribution for simple crimes. But as I studied the context and implementation of these laws, I realized that the Babylonians had created something far more sophisticated, a system that used punishment not just to address individual crimes, but to maintain complex social hierarchies and economic relationships. Every punishment was calibrated not just to the crime, but to the social status of both the criminal and the victim, creating a mathematical matrix of suffering that ensured that justice would reinforce the existing order rather than challenge it. The Babylonians had turned punishment into a tool of social engineering, and they had made it so effective that their legal innovations influenced civilizations for over 3 millennia. The Babylonian practice of status-based punishment reveals the true sophistication of their approach to justice. If a nobleman struck another nobleman, he paid a fine. If a nobleman struck a commoner, he paid a smaller fine. If a commoner struck a nobleman, he lost his hand. But here's where it gets truly Babylonian. If a slave struck anyone, the punishment wasn't just physical. It was designed to reinforce the slave's status while simultaneously protecting the economic interests of the slave's owner. The slave might be branded, marking them permanently as a criminal, but the owner would be compensated for the loss of the slave's productivity during their recovery. This created a system where every punishment served multiple purposes: retribution, deterrence, social control, and economic efficiency. The Babylonians had understood that punishment could be used to maintain not just order, but the specific type of order that benefited those in power. They had created a mathematical system for distributing suffering, and they had made it so comprehensive that it addressed every possible social relationship and every conceivable crime. The Code of Hammurabi also reveals the Babylonian innovation of mirror punishment, making the criminal experience exactly what they had inflicted on others, but with a twist that demonstrates their understanding of human psychology. If a doctor's treatment killed a patient, the doctor's son would be killed. If a builder's house collapsed and killed the owner, the builder's son would be killed. This wasn't just about proportional revenge, it was about creating a system where the punishment would be more psychologically devastating than simply killing the criminal themselves. The Babylonians understood that most people could face their own death with some degree of courage, but watching their loved ones suffer for their crimes was unbearable. They had weaponized the bonds of family and love, turning them into instruments of justice that were more effective than any physical torture. The psychological sophistication of this approach is genuinely disturbing. They had created a system where the punishment was designed to be more painful than the crime, ensuring that the memory of justice would be burned into the consciousness of everyone who witnessed it. But perhaps the most innovative aspect of Babylonian punishment was their development of temporal justice, punishments that were designed to unfold over time, creating ongoing psychological pressure that could last for years or even decades. If someone defaulted on a debt, they didn't just lose their property, they entered a state of debt slavery that could last for generations. Their children and grandchildren would be born into obligations created by their ancestors' crime, and the entire family line would be marked by their criminal heritage. But here's what makes this punishment truly Babylonian. It was designed to be escapable through specific actions, creating a system where the criminal and their descendants would spend their entire lives trying to atone for the original offense. The criminal would be forced to work for their victim's family, but they would never know exactly how much work would be required to satisfy the debt. This created a state of perpetual anxiety and hope that was more psychologically devastating than simple slavery. The Babylonians had discovered that uncertainty was more torturous than certainty, and they had built an entire legal system around this insight. They had turned punishment into a form of temporal maze that could trap entire families for generations. The Assyrian machinery of terror. The Assyrian Empire built its power on fear, and their approach to punishment was designed not just to address crime, but to terrorize entire populations into submission. When I first encountered Assyrian punishment records, I thought I was reading propaganda. Surely no civilization could be this systematically brutal. But as I cross-referenced archaeological evidence with their own royal inscriptions, I realized that the Assyrians had created something unprecedented, a system of punishment that was designed to be so horrifying that the mere threat of it would prevent rebellion and maintain order across an empire that stretched from Iran to Egypt. They had weaponized human imagination, creating punishments so elaborate and terrifying that they became legendary, and the legends themselves became tools of control. The Assyrians understood that the most effective punishment was the one that never had to be carried out because everyone was too afraid to commit the crime. They had created a system of preemptive psychological warfare that was more effective than any army. The Assyrian practice of architectural punishment reveals their understanding of how physical space could be used to intensify psychological suffering. When they captured a rebellious city, they didn't just execute the leaders. They incorporated their suffering into the very structure of the city itself. Rebel leaders were skinned alive, and their skins were used to cover the walls of public buildings. Their heads were impaled on spikes that were arranged in geometric patterns around the city's main square, creating a visual display that was both terrifying and aesthetically organized. But here's what makes this punishment truly Assyrian. It was designed to be permanent. The skins and heads were treated with preservatives that would keep them recognizable for years, and the displays were maintained by city officials who were required to replace any deteriorating elements. The punishment became part of the city's architecture, a permanent reminder of the consequences of rebellion. Citizens would pass these displays every day, and children would grow up seeing them as a normal part of their environment. The Assyrians had discovered that the most effective deterrent was not the threat of punishment, but the constant visual reminder of what punishment looked like. The Assyrian innovation of cascade punishment represents perhaps the most systematically terrifying approach to justice ever developed. When someone committed a crime against the state, the punishment didn't just affect them, it affected everyone, connected to them in an expanding circle of suffering. The criminal's immediate family was executed, their extended family was enslaved, their friends were tortured, their neighbors were relocated, and their entire community was marked as suspect. But the Assyrians took this concept even further. They documented each stage of the punishment in detail, creating written records that would be read aloud in other cities as a warning of what could happen to anyone who defied Assyrian authority. The punishment became a story that was told throughout the empire, and the story itself became a form of punishment for those who heard it. The Assyrians had understood that punishment could be both physical and narrative, and they had created a system where the telling of the punishment was as important as the punishment itself. They had turned justice into a form of psychological warfare that could be deployed across vast distances and different cultures. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Assyrian punishment was their development of educational torture, a system where the punishment was designed to teach specific lessons to specific audiences. When they captured enemy soldiers, they didn't just kill them. They punished them in ways that would demonstrate particular military lessons to anyone who might be watching. Soldiers who had retreated were forced to crawl on their bellies for miles, demonstrating the futility of cowardice. Soldiers who had shown excessive bravery were tortured to death slowly, demonstrating that heroism was pointless against Assyrian power. Officers were forced to watch their men die, demonstrating the consequences of leadership. Each punishment was calibrated to deliver a specific message to a specific audience, and the Assyrians maintained detailed records of which punishments were most effective at preventing particular types of resistance. They had created a systematic approach to psychological conditioning that used individual suffering to modify mass behavior. The Assyrian Empire lasted for over 6 centuries, and their approach to punishment was so effective that it influenced military thinking well into the modern era. They had discovered that the most powerful weapon was not the sword, but the fear of what the sword could do. The Greek paradox of philosophical punishment. Athens gave the world democracy, but their approach to punishment reveals a paradox that would haunt Western civilization for millennia. How can a society that values individual freedom and rational thought justify the systematic infliction of suffering on its citizens? When I studied Athenian legal practices, I discovered that they had developed a system of punishment that was simultaneously more humane and more psychologically sophisticated than anything that had come before. The Athenians understood that punishment in a democratic society couldn't rely on terror or absolute authority. It had to be justified through reason and accepted by the community. This led them to develop punishments that were designed not just to inflict suffering, but to educate both the criminal and the community about the nature of justice, morality, and social responsibility. They had created a system where punishment became a form of public philosophy, and the process of justice became as important as the outcome. But this intellectual approach to punishment led to innovations that were, in their own way, more disturbing than the brutal simplicity of earlier civilizations. The Athenian practice of ostracism represents perhaps the most psychologically sophisticated punishment ever devised by a democratic society. Once a year, Athenian citizens could vote to exile one of their fellow citizens for 10 years, without trial, without appeal, and without the possibility of return. The person who was ostracized lost everything: their property, their family, their identity as an Athenian, but they retained their life and their theoretical freedom. They could go anywhere else in the world, but they could never return home. What makes this punishment truly Athenian is that it was designed to be self-inflicted by the community. The citizens themselves chose who to exile, and they had to live with the consequences of their choice. The punishment was democratic, but it was also irreversible and absolute. The Athenians had discovered that the most effective punishment in a free society was the one that the society imposed on itself, and they had created a system where the act of punishment reinforced the values and unity of the community that was doing the punishing. But ostracism also revealed the dark side of democracy, the tyranny of the majority, the power of popular opinion to destroy individual lives, and the way that democratic processes could be used to legitimize cruelty. The Athenian approach to capital punishment reveals their understanding of how death could be used not just to end life, but to make philosophical statements about the nature of justice and the relationship between the individual and the state. The execution of Socrates provides the perfect example of how Athenians could turn even death into a form of education. Socrates was sentenced to drink hemlock, a poison that would kill him slowly, and allow him to remain conscious and articulate until the final moments. But the real punishment wasn't the death. It was the requirement that Socrates administer the poison to himself, making his execution a form of suicide and forcing him to participate in his own destruction. The Athenians had created a system where the criminal became complicit in their own punishment, and the act of punishment became a demonstration of the state's moral authority. Socrates used his execution as an opportunity to teach his final lesson about the nature of justice, virtue, and the examined life. But this was only possible because the Athenians had designed the punishment to allow for such philosophical reflection. They had created a system where even death could be transformed into a form of education, and the process of dying became as important as the fact of death itself. But perhaps the most distinctly Athenian innovation in punishment was their development of therapeutic justice, the idea that punishment should be designed not just to inflict suffering, but to reform the criminal and restore them to productive citizenship. When someone committed a crime, they weren't just punished, they were enrolled in a process of moral education that was designed to address the underlying causes of their criminal behavior. This might involve public service, participation in religious rituals, or engagement with philosophical discussions about the nature of virtue and justice. The criminal was required to demonstrate not just that they had been sufficiently punished, but that they had been morally transformed by the experience. The Athenians had understood that punishment in a democratic society had to serve multiple purposes: retribution, deterrence, and rehabilitation. They had created a system where the goal of punishment was not just to make the criminal suffer, but to make them a better person. This therapeutic approach to justice was genuinely revolutionary, but it also created new forms of psychological pressure that were, in their own way, more invasive than physical torture. The Athenians had discovered that the most effective way to control behavior was not to threaten the body, but to reshape the soul. The Chinese harmony of systematic suffering. Imperial China developed an approach to punishment that was based on the Confucian principle of harmony, the idea that individual suffering could be justified if it served the greater good of society. When I first encountered Chinese legal texts, I was struck by their emphasis on moral education and social rehabilitation. But as I studied the actual implementation of these principles, I realized that the Chinese had created a system of punishment that was more systematically comprehensive than anything that had come before. Every aspect of the criminal's life, their family relationships, their social status, their economic position, their spiritual beliefs, was subject to state intervention and modification. The Chinese had understood that true social control required more than just physical punishment. It required the complete reconstruction of the criminal's identity and their relationship to society. They had created a system where punishment became a form of social engineering, and the process of justice became a tool for maintaining not just order, but the specific type of order that served the interests of the imperial state. The Chinese practice of family punishment represents perhaps the most comprehensive approach to justice ever developed by any civilization. When someone committed a serious crime, the punishment didn't just affect them, it affected their entire family line, extending both backward and forward through generations. The criminal's parents were punished for failing to properly educate their child. Their children were punished for carrying the taint of their parents' crime, and their grandchildren were born into a world where their opportunities were limited by their ancestors' actions. But here's what makes this punishment truly Chinese. It was designed to be redemptive as well as punitive. The family could work together to atone for the criminal's actions, and through proper behavior, they could gradually restore their social status and their children's opportunities. The punishment created a system where the criminal's entire family became invested in their rehabilitation, and the process of atonement became a community effort that could last for generations. The Chinese had discovered that the most effective way to control individual behavior was to make the individual responsible not just for their own fate, but for the fate of everyone they loved. The Chinese innovation of bureaucratic punishment reveals their understanding of how administrative systems could be used to create forms of suffering that were more psychologically devastating than physical torture. When someone was sentenced to punishment by the imperial bureaucracy, they entered a maze of offices, procedures, and requirements that could consume years of their life. They would be required to appear before different officials, fill out numerous forms, provide testimony about their crime, and demonstrate their remorse through specific actions. But here's what made this punishment truly Chinese. It was designed to be technically fair and rational, but practically impossible to complete successfully. The bureaucratic requirements were so complex and contradictory that most people would fail to meet them, providing justification for additional punishment. The criminal would spend years navigating a system that was designed to frustrate and humiliate them, all while maintaining the pretense that they were being given a fair opportunity to redeem themselves. The Chinese had discovered that the most effective form of punishment was not dramatic violence, but systematic administrative harassment that could destroy a person's will to resist without ever appearing to be unjust. But perhaps the most sophisticated aspect of Chinese punishment was their development of cultural punishment, the systematic use of shame, social isolation, and cultural humiliation to modify behavior. When someone committed a crime, they weren't just punished legally. They were subjected to a comprehensive campaign of social ostracism that was designed to make them feel like an outsider in their own culture. Their name was posted in public places, their crime was announced in local newspapers, their family was required to disown them publicly, and their friends and neighbors were encouraged to shun them. But the real sophistication of this punishment lay in its reversibility. The criminal could regain their social status through proper behavior, public demonstrations of remorse, and contributions to community welfare. The punishment created a system where the criminal was motivated not just by fear of physical suffering, but by the desire to regain their place in society. The Chinese had understood that the most powerful form of control was not the threat of punishment but the promise of redemption, and they had created a system where the criminal became an active participant in their own rehabilitation. They had turned punishment into a form of social theater where the criminal, the community, and the state all played specific roles in a performance that reinforced the values and authority of the imperial system. The Aztec rituals of cosmic justice. The Aztec Empire developed an approach to punishment that was based on their understanding of the cosmic order and the relationship between individual actions and universal harmony. When I first encountered Aztec legal texts, I was struck by their emphasis on ritual purification and spiritual restoration. But as I studied the actual implementation of these principles, I realized that the Aztecs had created a system of punishment that was more spiritually sophisticated than anything that had come before. They understood that crime wasn't just a violation of human law. It was a disruption of the cosmic order that required specific ritual actions to restore balance to the universe. Every punishment was designed not just to address the immediate crime, but to perform a spiritual function that would heal the damage done to the cosmic harmony. The Aztecs had created a system where punishment became a form of religious ritual, and the process of justice became a tool for maintaining not just social order, but cosmic order. The Aztec practice of flower wars represents perhaps the most ritualized approach to punishment ever developed by any civilization. When someone committed a serious crime, they weren't just executed. They were given the opportunity to die in ritual combat that would allow them to achieve spiritual purification through death in battle. The criminal was provided with weapons and training, and they were matched against skilled warriors in elaborate ceremonies that could last for days. But here's what makes this punishment truly Aztec. It was designed to be spiritually transformative for everyone involved. The criminal could achieve redemption through courage in battle. The warriors could demonstrate their skill and devotion to the gods, and the community could witness the restoration of cosmic balance through ritual violence. The punishment became a form of religious theater where individual suffering was transformed into collective spiritual experience. The Aztecs had understood that the most effective punishment was not just the infliction of suffering, but the creation of meaning through suffering. And they had developed a system where death became a form of spiritual achievement rather than simple termination. The Aztec innovation of sacrificial punishment reveals their understanding of how individual death could be used to serve cosmic purposes. When someone committed a crime that threatened the cosmic order, they weren't just killed. They were sacrificed in elaborate rituals that were designed to restore balance to the universe. The criminal's heart was removed while they were still alive, and their blood was offered to the gods as payment for the cosmic damage their crime had caused. But the real sophistication of this punishment lay in its spiritual logic. The criminal was told that their death would serve a cosmic purpose, that their suffering would help maintain the balance of the universe, and that their sacrifice would benefit all of humanity. The punishment created a system where the criminal could find meaning in their death, and the community could find reassurance in the knowledge that cosmic order was being maintained through their sacrifice. The Aztecs had discovered that the most effective way to make people accept even the most extreme punishments was to convince them that their suffering served a purpose larger than themselves. But perhaps the most distinctly Aztec innovation in punishment was their development of transformative punishment, the idea that certain crimes could only be addressed by literally transforming the criminal into something else. When someone committed a crime that was seen as fundamentally changing their nature,